All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the New Testament. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 14, verses 1 through 20. And we need to recall that we're right in the middle of this central section of Revelation where the curtain is effectively being pulled back on who or what lies behind the affliction and difficulty and persecution that's plaguing God's people. When we say God's people, we're talking about the original readers, God's people in John's day that were the first to read these visions that John described for them, but also God's people throughout history still down to today. What lies behind the persecution and the affliction that is happening to them? And what Revelation 12, 13, and 14 shows us is that there is an unholy trinity, a dragon and two beasts. That's who lies behind it all. So while there are human actors involved in the affliction and the tribulation that's afflicting God's people, they're not the only ones at play. They are like pawns in a war between the Trinity itself, God the Father, Son, Spirit, and this unholy trinity, the dragon and the two beasts. And that's what Revelation 12, 13, and 14 is showing us. And this section, Revelation 14, 1 through 20, is directly connected to the preceding section. So let me read the end of chapter 13 again so you can hear the connection with chapter 14. So Revelation chapter 13, 15 through 17 says, "And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause all who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hands and on their forehead. And he decrees that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name." That's where Revelation 13 ends. And then listen to how Revelation 14 verse 1 picks up. "And then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him the 144,000 who had his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads." Do you hear the connection between the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of chapter 14? The end of chapter 13 says, this is those who are marked with the beast. They have his name on their forehead and on his hands. Chapter 14 picks up with this vision of the Lamb with his name on his people's forehead. And so you're either marked by the beast or you're standing with the Lamb marked by him with his name on your forehead. And that's the connection between the end of 13 and chapter 14. And so this section that we're going to look at in detail here flows directly out of the preceding section as well. And so to pick up again in chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads." Recall back in chapter 7 where we first met the 144,000. And there we saw them and connected it here with this section as God's people. That's who this represents. This is all of God's people, past and present. 144,000 we noted is the combination of 12 times 12. 12 being the 12 tribes of Israel, and 12 being the 12 apostles. So 12 times 1,000. All of God's people, the complete number of them. And they stand in contrast to those who are marked by the beast. So you either have the mark of the beast or you have the name of the Lamb and his Father on your foreheads. And notice that they're standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion. So the Lamb is on Mount Zion and they're standing with him. And literally, Mount Zion referred to a specific portion of ancient Jerusalem. But in the New Testament, it signifies the heavenly city and the gathering of God's people. So, for example, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and 23 says, "But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, and to the general assembly, that is the church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all. Notice there in Hebrews chapter 12, Mount Zion is also described as the heavenly Jerusalem. It's the general assembly, that is the gathering of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. They've been marked out in heaven as God's people. That's who we're seeing here. Also in Revelation 14, standing on Mount Zion with the Lamb. That's the 144,000. And the fact that it's called Mount Zion here in Revelation 14 doesn't seem to be random. Elsewhere in the book of Revelation, God's city is referred to as the New Jerusalem. And so it makes sense that as we continue that imagery to be consistent, we're also going to note Mount Zion as part of that. So why specifically Mount Zion here? Well, there's probably two reasons. One, in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, Mount Zion is noted as the place of God's dwelling. It's where God's throne is. It's where God dwells, if you read through the Psalms. Not only that, in the Old Testament prophets, Mount Zion is also the place where the Messiah will come and will stand as he prepares to make war on the nations, where he'll stand as victor and deliverer of his people. So I suspect that's why, as this vision unfolds for John, he sees Jesus on Mount Zion. Jesus is here as the victor and the deliverer of his people. It also makes sense of some of the details in this scene, as we'll note here in a second down below. So, continue on. Verse 2 says, "And I heard a voice from heaven." So John has seen the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. He's gathered with all of his people who are marked out as belonging to him. "And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice which I heard was also like the sound of harpists playing on their harps." So what he hears is this voice, this sound that's loud and thunderous, and yet melodic and beautiful, like harps. Why is that? Well, because it's the voices of myriads of followers of the Lamb now joining in the song in heaven, singing their praise to him. And so verse 3 says, "And they sang a new song." This is what John hears. They sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. Just keep in mind where John is at when he's seeing this vision, right? Recall all the way back in chapter 4 and 5 that John is in the throne room of heaven, and the drama takes place there in the throne room, and he sees these visions, right? And so that's where we're at now. So this crowd, this 144,000 that he just said is like he saw them standing on Mount Zion. He knew that's where they're at. But since the drama is taking place right there in the throne room, now they're joining in the worship of heaven, singing a song to the Lamb. And so they're adding their voices to the heavenly chorus of praise. Some suggest that since they're in heaven, maybe they picture the faithful who have died, or maybe even have been martyred for their faith. I think it's just as possible that the drama is simply being played out there in the throne room. And so it pictures all of God's people who are signified by this 144,000. And so they're singing this song to the Lamb. It's their own song as the redeemed. No one was able to learn the song except the 144,000 who had been purchased from the earth. Notice that word purchased. It carries the same idea as the word redeemed. The idea of redemption is someone paying a price to set someone free. And that's why God's people are described as purchased. They've been redeemed. Jesus, by his blood, paid their liberation price, and now they belong to him. And so they've been purchased out from the earth. And they stand before the Messiah himself on his throne, and they're singing a song to him. So these are God's redeemed people. But as the scene unfolds, they're also pictured as like not only the people of the Messiah, but sort of like the Messiah's army with him standing on Zion. And that's why verse 4 says what it does. Initially, verse 4 sounds kind of odd, but it fits with the imagery of King Jesus and his army standing on Mount Zion. And so it says in verse 4, "These are the ones," that is the 144,000, "who have the capacity to sing this song, those who are purchased out of the earth. These are the ones who have not defiled themselves with women. They are celibate." the imagery of celibate seems to be just that, imagery. Doesn't seem necessarily to be literal. Remember, part of this drama and the imagery of all of it is what it signifies. And I think the reason they're pictured this way is because they are here pictured as the Lord's faithful army. And the military requirements in the Jewish scriptures said that only men of a certain age were allowed in the military, and they had to keep themselves from being defiled with women while they served in the military. I think that's what we have going on here in Revelation 14. This is a picture of God's people now using imagery to envision them as the Lord's faithful army. So the 144,000, that is God's people, are pictured as the Messiah's army. And John, just to make it clear, in the second half of verse 4, specifies, he says, these are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been purchased from mankind as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. In other words, John's saying all right, I've described them as in kind of militaristic terms as those who have kept themselves from women. But to be perfectly clear, these are the followers of the Lamb. That's who he's talking about. The 144,000. They are followers of the Lamb. They've been purchased from mankind. They are first fruits to God and to the Lamb. And that idea of first fruits means they've been dedicated to the Lord. We can see that idea in the Old Testament sacrifices and offerings. There was first fruits, right? Had to be offered. It's dedicated to the Lord. Interestingly enough, even in Greek business documents, people can be spoken of as first fruits when they are offered to a deity, like to be temple servants, to work specifically in the temple. And so that's the idea here. The followers of the Lamb and the 144,000 are the Lord's army who belong to the Lord. They're dedicated to him. John goes on and continues to describe them in verse 5 and says, and no lie was found in their mouths because they are blameless. The devil may be a liar. The world may be full of liars, but not the Lord's people, not the Lord's army. They don't participate in lies. They're blameless. Then, following that, John records 3 angelic announcements that all point once again to the end. And that's where this vision is going to go. An end which the drama then will actually unveil in more detail in the following chapters right out of this. And so 3 angelic announcements. The first one shows up here in verse 6. It says, I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven. That is, flying somewhere between the earth below and the outer space, what we would call outer space, the heavens above, mid-heaven, with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth and to every nation, tribe, language, and people. In other words, he's got an announcement for all mankind. Verse 7 says what it is. And he said with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who has made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of water. In other words, judgment is coming. Judgment's on the way. It's right there. We're at the final moment. So fear God and give him glory. Worship the one true God. Then, verse 8, another angel, a second one, followed saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And Revelation chapter 18 will actually give a more complete portrayal of Babylon's fall, so we'll talk about it more there. And that actually helps us understand what's happening here at the end of chapter 14, where we're getting a description of the end in chapter 14, and then chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 all kind of say, let's look at details of that a little more closely, and we zoom in on some details. So we'll zoom in on the fall of Babylon in more detail in chapter 18. But for now, just know that literally, in history, Babylon was the great pagan city that had taken the Jews captive into exile 600 years prior to John's day. But by this time period, Babylon came to represent like the archetype for the arch enemy of God and his people. So any and all great cities or empires that arrayed themselves against God and his people, well, they could be referred to as Babylon. That's what's going on here. So in a very real sense, in the book of Revelation, Babylon should be thought of as like the city of man. It's roughly equivalent to what John means by the world when he writes in 1 John, do not love the world. What John says in a fairly straightforward way in that sentence is portrayed dramatically and vividly in the book of Revelation as Babylon. That's what we're talking about. And so here, the announcement is the fall of Babylon, fallen. She's going to be destroyed. The city of man is going to be ruined and fall. Then we get the final angelic announcement in verse 9 and following, where it says, then another angel, a third one, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. They have no rest day or night, those who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. In other words, all those who are marked out as belonging to the beast and who don't belong to the Lamb, well, guess what? They are going to endure the wrath of God, which is going to be now mixed full strength. Throughout the book of Revelation, we've seen partial expressions of God's wrath, but it's time for the fullness of God's wrath to come. And those who belong to the city of man, those who belong to the beasts of this world, well, they are going to suffer the fullness of God's wrath forever and ever. And so with that then, verse 12, John says, here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And effectively, that verse restates what was also said in Revelation chapter 13. It's a call to resist Babylon and to resist the beast that Babylon serves and that Babylon embodies. Resist that and be faithful to God and faithful to Jesus. And then it's followed up with a pronouncement of blessing, a beatitude on all the followers of the Lamb who are faithful unto death. So verse 13 says, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. This beatitude speaks a word of blessing over all of those who are faithful to the Lord, clear up until their deaths. So however difficult or however exhausting their sojourn in this world may have been, they can now rest. And notice that that idea of they get rest stands in contrast to the followers of the beast who have no rest day or night. But not so with the followers of the Lamb. They, by persevering in their faith and faithfulness, are promised a day of ultimate and final rest, where all things will be well, and their soul can be at peace once and forever. And so now we once again come to Judgment Day, pictured here in Revelation 14 as the harvest of the earth. The scene began with Jesus standing with his people on Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, singing a song that only they could learn. And then it concluded with a series of 3 angelic pronouncements that pronounced judgment on the city of man, Babylon, and judgment on all those marked by the beast. So now it concludes with the judgment portrayed as a grain harvest and a grape harvest. And this imagery is familiar, and not only literally because grain and grape harvests were common practices throughout the Mediterranean world, but it was imagery that had been used by the Old Testament prophets before. For example, Joel, in the prophet Joel in the Old Testament, Joel chapter 3, verses 12 through 14 says this, let the nations be awakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come tread the grapes, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And here in Revelation chapter 14, we get that same pairing of the harvest is ready, so put in the sickle, tread the grapes in the winepress. Why? Because it's time for decision to be made, for judgment to be rendered. And so we get in Revelation 14:14, then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. He's ready to harvest. He's got a sickle, and he's ready to cut down the wheat, the grain. And verse 15 says, and another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. It's harvest day. It's time to put your sickle in and cut down the grain. It's harvest season. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. All the grain was cut down. And then, verse 17, another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has the power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So in parallel to the last one, where the grain was ripe, well, now the grapes are ripe, and it's time to harvest the grapes as well. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters of grapes from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. In the ancient world, grapes were harvested late summer, early fall, and they were gathered into baskets, all the clusters cut off, gathered into baskets, and then dumped into stone or wooden troughs, where people then, barefooted people, would stomp the grapes into juice, and the grapes then would be pressed out and flow into vats where they would gather them up. Now, that's the picture here. And so the harvest of the earth now is grapes being cut down, thrown into those wine presses where people are ready to stomp them, so that the blood of the grapes, that's the imagery here, the juice of the grapes could then flow out. And as the imagery continues in verse 20, it says, and the winepress was trampled outside the city. That is, outside the city of God. And blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of 1,600 stadia. And 1,600 stadia is roughly about 180 miles or 300 kilometers. In other words, a significant distance. But the point isn't really to try to press the imagery with how far it flowed literally. The point is the enormity of God's judgment on the city of man. That's what we're picturing here. The earth is being judged, and the judgment is enormous. And that's the whole point of the imagery. And Craig Keener notes that in the ancient world, these kinds of vivid and graphic descriptions of judgment on the earth, judgment on the wicked, were fairly common. You have other places where the image of blood flowing in terrible streams sort of became like standard ways of describing warfare, as well as then used in Jewish writings for God's judgment on the world. And so that's what we get here, is using familiar and sort of standard descriptions of warfare and judgment and victory. And it's intended to be graphic, and it's intended to be dramatic, because it ought to call God's people to flee compromise. It ought to call God's people to be faithful followers of the Lamb, and to be reassured that someday the faithful followers of the Lamb, those who endure unto death, they will be vindicated. They will be shown to be right. And that those who have afflicted them, those who have persecuted them, those who have embodied the reign of the beast, they will get theirs, and God will make it right someday. And as we noted at the outset of our discussion here, this scene is clearly connected to the scene in chapter 13, the scene of the two beasts there. And that's made clear by the climactic announcement of judgment on all who are marked by the beasts. And the two scenes together, chapter 13 and chapter 14, remind the original readers and us that there really are only two groups of people on the earth, two and only two: those who serve the beast and are marked by him, or those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes and are sealed by him. Those really are the only two groups of people on earth. Not only that, this scene also reminds us that final judgment is coming. And how you view it depends really on where you're standing. For those who have loved this world and lived for this world, well, they're going to be squashed like grapes in a wine press. And it's awful. And it's an awful picture, right? Like, that's the picture used to describe what's going to happen to those who lived and loved this world. But those who love God and are loyal to the Lamb, well, guess what? They faithfully endure the awfulness of this world, and someday they're going to get rest from all their labors. And this scene then is meant to inspire those of us who follow Jesus to be faithful unto death, to not give in to the powers of this world, to not be seduced by the enticements and luxuries of Babylon. Instead, we can keep Jesus' commands and be faithful to the end, because we know someday we will rest from all our labors. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that exists only because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people. And so as we seek to see this ministry reach more people and be translated into other languages so that more people can reap the benefit of clear, down-to-earth Bible teaching, let me just say thanks a ton for your support. And if you have been challenged or encouraged by this ministry and by the Listener's Commentary, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? You can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com and either clicking the Give button and putting in a dollar amount for a one-time or monthly donation, or you can join the Study Hub and support the ministry that way. Thanks a ton for your support.